This is probably the most important election of our lifetime. Our rights as African Americans hang in the balance, and even our democracy is in danger. And the one thing that the GOP is focused on, and has been since 1965, is the Voting Rights Act. Today, I'm going to talk about the Voting Rights Act, how it's been attacked, and how we can protect it. Stay tuned. Hello, everybody. I am Attorney Augustus Corbett, one half of the Defiant Lawyers. Each and every week, we bring you at least one legal analysis of some trending story having to do with politics, policies, personalities, or pop culture to empower you with the information you need to defy an unjust legal system and to nullify systemic racism. If that interests you, and I hope it does, please like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell so you'll get notification when we upload one of these videos. Hope everybody is doing well. I certainly am. It's been a few days since I've uploaded a video, but as you know, I take my time because what I do with our channel, or what we do, is we teach. We don't give you these sound bites without providing, supporting, corroborating evidence, because, again, we want to empower you, to equip you with the information to fight back, to defend our rights, because our rights are under assault. Again, especially the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Fair Housing Act, even the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and other very important civil rights laws are under attack by the GOP. They're even attacking Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I understand why. Because if they can discredit him, then they can discredit the accomplishments of the civil rights movement. I listened to the gubernatorial candidate for North Carolina, Mark Robinson. I've been doing research on him and making some comments about him. And among many other things, Mr. Robinson attacks Dr. King and the civil rights movement. He even called the civil rights movement crap, and Dr. King an inferior pastor, a communist. Well, that's not just to be offensive. That is by design. And oh, by the way, Mark Robinson is an African American. That's not by accident or happenstance. That is a well thought out plan by MAGA, by white supremacists, by the GOP. You may say, well, why would an African American man be involved in something like that? I'm not going to talk about the man's motives. That's not what this channel is about. I'm not interested, as I said in an earlier video, I'm not interested in beefs with other folks. They do themselves, I do me. And we love African American people, and we don't see any upside of supporting white supremacists who are dead set and have been so for 400 years to keep African Americans in an oppressed, subjugated situation. We will not help them do that. And there are a whole lot of YouTubers who are out here just saying some really crazy, uninformed stuff. I mean, really, the stuff that some of these YouTubers are saying about voting and about voting the couch and voting for Donald Trump and MAGA, it is amazing that anybody even listens to them. And many of them are African Americans. They're saying some really crazy stuff. And so it is really important, therefore, that there be a voice out here to counter all that nonsense. And that's the reason why these videos are so very important. Now, as I said in previous videos, please take the time to listen. I know they're longer than some of you are used to listening to a video. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 8 minutes, etc. Sometimes that's good. But when I'm dealing with the kind of stuff that I'm dealing with, it takes some time. And I am an attorney. So I got to try to take you beyond what you're going to get from some of these folks who are commenting on legal issues and they don't know what they're talking about. They're giving you sound bites. They're giving you their opinions. Well, I'm giving you the law. I'm giving you constitutional law, civil rights law, that is extremely important to our plight as a people. So today we're going to talk about the Voting Rights Act, but I do need you to listen all the way through, all the way through. I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to try to take these legal, constitutional, civil rights concepts and cases and make them as plain as possible. All right, let's get into it. Nothing to it but to do it, the way they used to say it. And I'm going to use both pictures and a video. We're getting ready to watch a video by Merrick Garland. He gave a speech in an African-American church. There are some folks on YouTube who took issue with Merrick Garland standing in an African-American church. I don't know why. The African-American church has always been the place where we connect, where we not only worship God, but also plan our actions against white supremacy, against racism. It has always been the center of our community, about like the Jewish temple or the synagogue in the Jewish community, as well as white evangelical churches in the white community. They are really, really politicizing, a lot of them, their sermons in their churches. I mean, you see it all over YouTube, TikTok, etc. So I don't know why any African American would have a problem with African Americans allowing someone to come in their church and talk about issues of justice. As a minister, by the way, I know the Bible says a lot about justice. A lot. The Bible, yes. The book that many people think is a book written by the white man for the white man. That's nonsense. Once you understand how many people in the Bible are black, once you understand that as far back as Noah and his children, they are black people. So when you understand some things about the Bible, again, namely that justice is a huge part of the Bible, a huge part, then there's absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, everything is right with churches, African-American churches, being the vanguard and leader of movements of justice, like the civil rights movement. The folks who led the civil rights movement were clergy. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Reverend Hosea Williams, Reverend Joseph Lowry, Reverend C.T. Vivian. That was a church-based movement, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And they had it right because, again, just a basic understanding of Scripture, again, lets you know that the God of the Bible is a God of justice. Dr. King loved to quote a verse out of Amos, the book of Amos, an Old Testament book, where the prophet Amos quoted God as saying or speaking or inspired by God. Amos said that God wanted justice to roll down like a mighty stream. So anyone who says that we cannot fight for justice from our pulpits is ignorant of the Bible. All right? So we're going to go into a church, the Historical Tabernacle Baptist Church in Selma, Alabama, where Merrick Garland and Kristen Clark, who is over the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, were. And he was giving a warning, Merrick Garland, in about a 5-minute speech. I want you to hear all of it. Please take the time to listen to all of it. And then we will get into this lesson. All right? So let's get started. Here is Merrick Garland.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Pastor Kellever, for having me today. Thank you for having Kristen Clark, our great Civil Rights Division Assistant Attorney General. We are so grateful to be here with this congregation and this community. The Justice Department owes an enormous debt of gratitude for the courageous activists who marched here in Selma 59 years ago, and to those who will march today. There are many things that are open to debate in America. One thing that must not be open to debate is the right of every eligible citizen to vote and to have their vote counted. The right to vote is the cornerstone of our democracy and the right from which all other rights flow. It is a right that members of this community bled for. And yet progress in protecting the right to vote, especially for Black Americans, has never been steady. Indeed, throughout our country's history, before Bloody Sunday and after, the right to vote in America has been under attack. It was under attack in the wake of the Civil War and amidst Reconstruction, when white supremacists used violence and threats of violence to stop Black Americans from exercising their right to vote. It was at that time that the Department of Justice was founded, with the principal task of ensuring the rights guaranteed by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And in those first years, the Justice Department responded by successfully prosecuting more than 1,000 members of the Ku Klux Klan who were trying to violently stop Black Americans from voting. But the right to vote was still under attack nearly a century later, when Black residents trying to register to vote in this county and in jurisdictions across the country were required to take impossible tests that were designed to ensure that they failed. And the right to vote was under attack on Sunday, March 7, 1965, when civil rights activists set out to march from Selma to Montgomery and were met with horrific violence. The marchers' courage helped usher into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which gave the Justice Department important authorities to protect the right to vote. Because of that law, between 1965 and 2006, the Justice Department was able to block more than 1,200 restrictive voting changes in jurisdictions with a history of suppressing the vote. But as you well know, court decisions in recent years have drastically weakened the protections of the Voting Rights Act that marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge bled for 59 years ago. And since those decisions, there has been a dramatic increase in legislative measures that make it harder for millions of eligible voters to vote and to elect the representatives of their choice. Those measures include practices and procedures that make voting more difficult, redistricting maps that disadvantage minorities, and changes in voting administration that diminish the authority of locally elected or nonpartisan election administrators. Such measures threatened the foundation of our system of government. Some have even suggested giving state legislatures the power to set aside the choice of the voters themselves. This is not the way a representative democracy is supposed to work. The right to vote is still under attack. And that is why the Justice Department is fighting back. That is why one of the first things I did when I came into office was to double the size of the voting section of the Civil Rights Division. That is why we are challenging efforts by states and jurisdictions to implement discriminatory, burdensome, and unnecessary restrictions on access to the ballot, including those related to mail-in voting, the use of drop boxes, and voter ID requirements. That is why we are working to block the adoption of discriminatory redistricting plans that dilute the vote of black voters and other voters of color. We are holding accountable jurisdictions that fail to provide accessible vote centers for people with disabilities. We are defending the ability of private individuals, not just the government, to bring lawsuits under the key provisions of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We are joining with community groups and civil rights organizations across the country by intervening in cases to defend the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act's prohibition on voter intimidation, and to defend the Act's bar against voting practices or procedures that discriminate on the basis of race or color. There is so much more to do. Yet these are not the only threats that democracy is facing. Today, threats to the right to vote have expanded to target not just the voters themselves, but the citizens we rely on to fairly administer voting. Not just elected officials, not just paid administrators, but also the local volunteers who ensure that voting is available in every precinct. That's why I launched the Justice Department's Election Threats Task Force to combat threats against election workers. That's why we are aggressively investigating and prosecuting those who threaten election workers with violence. Just last Tuesday, for example, an Indiana man pled guilty to threatening to kill an election worker in Michigan, falsely claiming that the worker had, quote, frauded out America of a real election. And just last Thursday, we arrested a California man who transmitted a violent threat against an Arizona election official while falsely accusing that official of, quote, cheating the election. Our democracy cannot function if the public servants and civic-minded citizens who administer our elections fear for their lives. The Justice Department recognizes the urgency of this moment. Defending democracy was the Justice Department's founding purpose, and it is the foundation of everything we do today. We recognize that community and civic leaders here and across the country are advancing that work day in and day out. Our commitment to you is that we will never stop working with you and for you to ensure that every eligible voter can cast a vote that counts. In an editorial published after his death and 55 years after he'd led marchers to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, John Lewis recalled an important lesson taught by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Democracy is not a state, he said, it is an act, and each generation must do its part.
All right, so you heard Merrick Garland in his own words, the Attorney General, the man who oversees the civil rights enforcement in this nation, an African-American woman he mentioned. Kristen Clark is a stand-up woman. She has been fighting for civil rights for many years, a tremendous attorney. She was in the audience. It's just great to have somebody in the Department of Justice who is interested in protecting our right to vote and is still under assault. As the title says, racists still fear and fight black voters. Garland is right. He's absolutely right. General Garland is right. He's right on point. Now, I want you to hear from a Republican operative many years ago talk about the fact that they don't want people voting. Republicans don't want people voting.
How many of our Christians have what I call the goo-goo syndrome? Good government. They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
When this country was founded, the thought was only white men who own property should have the ability and right to vote. No one else. Not even white women. White women got the right to vote after blacks. Because that's been the thinking of this country. White men should run the country. And so they should be the ones who vote. No one else. Them. So that they can make the decisions, so that they can pass the laws, so that everyone else has to be subject to white male hegemony, white male dominance. So they have fought African Americans' right to vote since 1619. They don't want us voting because there is power in voting. When you have the ability to choose the person or people to represent you and your interests, that's power. That's power. And they don't want to give that power to African Americans, but there was nothing they could do after the Civil War. They had been beaten, and that radical Republican abolitionist movement were able to get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passed. Now, I explained in the video that Republican Party back then is not the Republican Party that we have today. The Dixiecrats and the Democratic Party that fought for slavery and fought against black equal rights, they have since moved over and realigned with the Republican Party. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were added to the Constitution, and the 15th Amendment is the one that we want to start looking at now. Certain parts of it are really, really important. All right, the 15th Amendment, Section 1. It says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Can you imagine our ancestors who had been in those fields, slaving, laboring, completely under the thumb of white men? Can you imagine what they felt knowing for the first time, being here on this continent, in this continent, that they can vote, that they can say who should be their representative, speaking up for them? We thank God for the 15th Amendment. Section 2, however, says that Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Why is that important? Because the 15th Amendment by itself, it does not give us really the right to vote. It just says that our right to vote shall not be denied nor abridged. But we need teeth. We need teeth added to the 15th Amendment. So those radical Republicans, those black and white people, Frederick Douglass and all the rest of them, said not only do we need the 15th Amendment, but we need legislation to enforce the 15th Amendment. Okay? Now, we're going to come to what that legislation became here in just a moment, what that legislation was and is to this day. All right, so despite the 15th Amendment, as I just explained, it had very little teeth, just some words on the Constitution. Therefore, white Southerners enacted black code laws and established a Jim Crow system to implement voter suppression. Now, when I use the word suppression, I'm talking about suppressing the black vote. There were methods that they used back then, and there are methods that they use today. Let me show you just a few of the methods they used back then. Literacy test. Well, you had to be able to read, for example, the Constitution or something else. And quite naturally, the newly freed slaves, enslaved Africans, were not literate because it was illegal for them to become literate. You could lose your life for reading, learning how to read. Frederick Douglass recounts in his autobiography how the enslaver acted when he learned that his wife had taught Frederick how to read. So it was a very risky thing that could cost you your life if you dared try to become literate. And they knew that. They knew that. So they implemented literacy tests. So before you could register to vote, read this provision of the Constitution or read this state law or read whatever. Blacks couldn't do it. Very few. Now, by the way, there were illiterate whites as well, but they were able to vote nonetheless because of grandfather clauses. In other words, if their grandfathers had the right to vote, then they could vote. They could just be included because of their grandfathers. Well, obviously, the grandfathers of our ancestors were likely enslaved as well, so they had no rights either. So literacy tests, poll taxes. Where were African Americans who were just recently freed from slavery? Where were they going to find money to pay a poll tax? And why should anyone have to pay a tax to vote anyway? That shouldn't cost. So they use poll taxes, literacy tests, as I just explained, grandfather clauses, which enabled nearly every white person to vote, but excluded black voters. Now, these are the things they used to keep our ancestors from voting despite the 15th Amendment. So many, many years after the addition of the 15th Amendment, blacks still were not able to vote. So they also use all white primaries. So, they just flat out said this particular primary, only whites can vote. No one else can vote. All right. What else? Counting jelly beans. They would say to a black person who dared to try to vote anyway, that took some courage right by itself. Would say, okay, how many jelly beans are in that jar? Or how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? If you can answer that, then you can vote. All these tricks, all these tactics and maneuvers to keep us from voting. And of course, violence. If you dared to try to register to vote, that could cost you your life and the life of your family. I'm going to show you just how risky it was for black people to even try to vote, to think about voting. So despite the addition of the 15th Amendment, blacks could not vote despite that addition, which is why Section 2 of the 15th Amendment is so important, because it authorized Congress to pass legislation. It took 100 years for that to happen. Slavery was abolished in 1865. The Voting Rights Act was signed into law 100 years later. So for 100 years, despite the 15th Amendment, our ancestors were not able to vote, disenfranchised, suppressed from voting, using those various techniques and others that I just showed you. But then in 1965, as I've shared in previous videos, Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. And that was the beginning of a new day for African Americans. That gave teeth, it gave enforcement rights to the 15th Amendment. And the Department of Justice was tasked with the responsibility and duty to enforce the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I'm going to show you how they do so in just a moment. But let me show you some pictures to kind of bring this home. All right, pictures. What's the old saying? A picture speaks louder than 1,000 words. So, of course, there was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who ultimately died so that we could have the right to vote, among other things. Dr. King led that movement. He and his colleagues knew the importance of the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These 4 little girls were murdered as they sat in a church in Birmingham, Alabama, because the KKK were trying to strike terror in the hearts of the African American community, to dare them to try to become voters. Murdered these precious 4 little black girls. How heinous and sickening and low down can you be to murder these children because you're so demented and hateful and demonic in your heart, so hateful that you don't want to see these people have an equal, fair opportunity to cast their votes. So you bomb a church. And going back to, again, where I said there are YouTubers who are like, why are churches involved in the fight for justice? Because the church, again, is the house of justice. If you really understand the Bible, it is the house of justice because the God of the Bible is a God of justice. And white people knew that. And so there have been thousands of church bombings, black church bombings. And we cannot forget, not long ago, when that demented white supremacist went into Mother Emanuel in South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, and murdered 9 people after having Bible study with them. That's how sick the people are that we're fighting. They're that sick. That's what Dr. King said. He said they're sick. 3 other people who gave their lives for our right to vote. Cheney, Swerner, Goodman. They were civil rights workers who were murdered trying to get us the right to vote. Medgar Evers died, was shot in the back as he was trying to get into his house to his wife and children, simply because he was trying to get us registered to vote. Then there's Bloody Sunday. I have the circle around John Lewis there, the late Representative John Lewis, who was cracked over the head with a billy club, almost killed as they tried to march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. Once again, trying to get us the right to vote. I get emotional. I get emotional because I know what prior generations have done for us to be able to cast our vote. It was and still is that important. Yet you have these folks on YouTube, black men, who say voting does nothing. Black men who say vote the couch. Black men who say vote for the very people who are trying to take away our vote and every other right that we have. Black men, the target of a lot of the white supremacy that we see. How is it that black men of all people in this country, who again is the target of a lot of this racism, systemic racism tends to target black men. What in the world are black men doing out here supporting white supremacists and advising the rest of us not to vote? What? What? Black men are the ones who tend to be most likely to support these white supremacists as they try to harm the black community. Yet black men are the ones that white supremacy hates the most. Make that make sense. Make that make sense. Make it make sense. You can't. John Lewis, the late Representative John Lewis, this woman here is laying out because she got beat, almost killed, trying to get us the right to vote. There she is sitting up. What was her crime? Nothing but trying to get you and me the opportunity to cast our vote. That's all she was doing. Here they are these two men are carrying off the wounded after they had been billy clubbed and ran over by horses on Bloody Sunday. Here are a group of white men who are in solidarity with the civil rights movement, who are kneeling and praying for our right to vote. A group of white men, many clergy, who join hands with the civil rights movement to get us the right to vote. And it's the reason I always say, not every white person is against us. Not every white person is against us. I said in a previous video, based on studies, most have implicit bias, but not all of them. There is the famous Edmund Pettus Bridge, and there is one of my heroes, John Lewis, who loves to talk about when he was living, who loved to talk about getting into good trouble. That's what I'm doing. I'm getting into good trouble. More of you need to get into good trouble with me and with us. By the way, go to our website, LLJP.org. LLJP.org. That stands for the Lazarus Law and Justice Project.org. So go and join our newsletter so that you can get the information that we are putting out. We're wanting to build a movement, as I've said in the past. So here is John Lewis, again, one of my heroes. And for every John Lewis, there were 10 George Wallaces, one of the most hateful, racist, segregationist, white supremacists that America, the world has ever known. The man in the middle, former governor of the state of Alabama, who ran for president. I talked about him a little bit in the previous video there. Of course, this group of hateful, racist white people with their Confederate flag who are out there doing everything they can to prevent black folks from voting. Here's another one of my heroes, Reverend C.T. Vivian, who faced down white segregationists to their faces as he led a group of people to get registered to vote. As you can see there, his face, his nose is bloodied because the infamous Sheriff Clark punched him in the nose as he stood there, as Reverend Vivian stood there and demanded the right for them to register. So you see, I get a little bit emotional when you have black folks out here telling us to vote the couch. When C.T. Vivian got punched in the nose, Dr. King got assassinated, Medgar Evers shot in the back, 4 little girls murdered in a church bombing. We got to take a look back to see the bridges that we've come over and the sacrifices made on our behalf. Think about that when someone says, vote the couch. No, they didn't die for me to vote the couch, to set it out. They didn't die for me to do that. I gotta go. It's irresponsible. It is insensitive. It's selfish not to vote when others have made these kind of sacrifices for us. Then, of course, here recently, these 2 brave sheroes who were attacked, threatened, simply because they were doing their jobs, just counting votes. And for that, they were viciously attacked and defamed, threatened. But they ended up winning a massive lawsuit because they dared to take on that white supremacist as he defamed them. That's the kind of people that I link arms with, not those who link arms with white supremacists. Now, before we move on, I want to share some more pictures with you. Some more people. Reverend George Lee, one of the first black people registered to vote in Humphreys County, used his pulpit and his printing press to urge others to vote. White officials offered Lee protection on the condition he end his voter registration efforts, but Lee refused and was murdered. He refused and was murdered. He deserves an applause. All of them do. And notice, he could have sold us out. He could have took their money and started saying, you know what, we shouldn't vote. He didn't do that. He turned their money down. He turned their privileges down and remained courageous and kept trying to get his folks to vote. I honor the Reverend George Lee in his memory. There's so many others, so many. Lamar Smith was shot dead on the courthouse lawn by a white man in broad daylight while dozens of people watched. The killer was never indicted because no one would admit they saw a white man shoot a black man. Smith had organized blacks to vote in a recent election. Do you see what our people did? You see how they valued the franchise, the ability to vote so that we can have a say on what happens in our lives? Do you see that? Emmett Till. Emmett Till was murdered by KKK, by white supremacists who were opposed to blacks voting. Willie Edwards Jr., these all back in the 50s, all of these precious people, all of them gave their lives, whites included. Medgar Evers, those 4 precious babies, Virgil Lamar Ware, 13 years old, was riding on the handlebars of his brother's bicycle when he was fatally shot by white teenagers. The white youth had come from a segregationist rally held in the aftermath of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, where those little girls were bombed. I could go on. There are many, many, many more people who died for our right to vote. And the nerve of some African-American man telling us to vote the couch or to vote for the very people who have gutted the Voting Rights Act. That would be the GOP. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So all these people died, gave their lives, their blood, their tears, their sweat. They stood up and faced the devil. They faced white supremacists. They faced KKK terrorists, knowing their lives were in danger, knowing their families were in danger. The result of that was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I just say thank you to those people. Thank you to every one of them. So let's take a closer look at the Voting Rights Act of 1965. There are several sections of the Voting Rights Act. First, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibits voting practices or procedures that discriminate on the basis of race, color, or membership in one of the language minority groups identified in Section 4F2 of the Act. So Section 2 is sort of a general catch-all section that prohibits any sort of discriminatory actions that interferes with a person's right to vote on the basis of race or color or because they don't speak English, etc. Section 2. And I'll come back to Section 2 in just a moment. Then there is Section 4. Section 4 targets areas where racial discrimination in voting was most common. So Section 4 essentially identified certain areas of the country, certain states like Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, those states that impose all these voting restrictions. Section 4 identifies those areas and applies some strong solutions when necessary. So Section 4, based on certain formulas, said these states here are notorious for blocking Black people, disenfranchising Black people, for implementing voter suppression. So these states got to be watched, and we must do something to these states. What did they do? Well, that's Section 5. In Section 5, the Voting Rights Act required that those states that I just explained to you had to first seek pre-approval from the DOJ before implementing any changes to their voting laws. So those states that were identified by Section 4 had to first send their proposed voting changes to the DOJ so that the DOJ could look at those proposed changes and determine whether or not they discriminated on the basis of race. Okay? So Section 4, Section 5, critical. And for many years, from 1965 until 2013, something happened in 2013. But from 1965 to 2013, those two sections of the Voting Rights Act protected our right to vote. But then something happened in 2013. What happened? Oh, you know I'm going to tell you. Before I do, let's look at 6 members of the United States Supreme Court. And the thing I want you to know about these 6 very conservative, anti-Black, anti-civil rights, anti-voting rights justices, The thing I want to tell you about them, is every single one of them have been committed since their early days as lawyers in rolling back or gutting or getting rid of, repealing the Voting Rights Act. That's been their careers. That's been their professional careers, to see the Voting Rights Act gutted, invalidated, weakened. That was accomplished in 2013 with this case, Shelby County versus Holder. So what does Shelby County do? Shelby County ruled that the formulas in Section 4 were outdated. Hence, Section 5 is invalidated until Congress fixes Section 4. Fixing Section 4 is the main purpose of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Bill. However, the GOP has blocked it. So let me back up. I want you to understand this. This is really important. So the Shelby County versus Holder case came before the United States Supreme Court. 5 justices ruled against a strong objection of the 4 other judges, especially Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But they were able to essentially say in that majority opinion that Section 4 was outdated. The formulas were outdated. Therefore, the states that had been identified as problematic, notorious states regarding voting rights, they were no longer required to submit their voting proposed changes to the Department of Justice. So, again, the majority in the Shelby County versus Holder case said the formula in Section 4 was outdated. In other words, they made the argument, John Roberts, the Chief Justice, wrote the majority opinion. He made the arguments that blacks were voting at an all-time record. So much so that they were able to elect the first black president in 2008 and re-elect him in 2012. So everything was fixed. Everything was okay. So those formulas don't work anymore. These states don't need to be required to get pre-clearance anymore. But it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg who made the strong point in her dissenting opinion that it is because of Section 4 and 5 that black folks are finally able to elect someone of their choice. And therefore, if you remove or do anything to invalidate 4 and or 5, you're essentially removing the umbrella that has kept black Americans dry since 1965. So she said, why would you remove the umbrella that has protected black Americans? Because you know, if you remove that umbrella, if you gut the Voting Rights Act, Section 4 and 5, the main sections, then you know what's going to happen. Those states are going to immediately pounce on the voting rights of African American people. Well, she was absolutely right. Because the day after the Shelby County case was handed down, states like Texas, North Carolina, Georgia, other states immediately, the next day, immediately implemented voter suppression laws. The next day, they started right back where they left off in 65. You see, our enemies, they play the long game. They'll never stop fighting us. They may change clothing. They may change their stripes. They may change parties, but they never stop. They are committed. But you know what? We are committed too. We will not relent. We will not stop fighting. It was the late Coretta Scott King who said, freedom is never really won because in each generation, you have to fight for it again. And that's the problem with a lot of African Americans. Because of the successes of the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, many of us have been able to become middle class, and therefore we now believe everything is okay. And that the rights that we have enjoyed are irrevocable. They are not irrevocable. They are destroying them like they did the Voting Rights Act. And they're not finished. So yes, because Section 4 was gutted and Section 5 became invalidated, the Voting Rights Act, again, did not have the teeth that it once had because its biggest prohibition against voter suppression was requiring those states to get pre-clearance, pre-approval from the Department of Justice. That no longer was required. So they could just implement whatever they wanted to do, and they immediately started doing so. Now, not the same kind of voter suppression laws that I told you about earlier, not poll taxes, not literacy tests, not grandfather clauses, not jelly beans, and all of that. No, new stuff. This is updated voter suppression. It's updated. It's 2023 style. Let's look at what they are. So again, the day after the Shelby County case was handed down, states like Texas, etc., immediately implemented voter suppression laws. What kind? First, requiring voter IDs. Now, let me get a little water before I address that. Because I know people are on YouTube saying, what is wrong with voter IDs? What is wrong with having to show your ID before you vote? That's what people say. What is wrong with that? I'm all ears. Explain it to me. What is wrong with that? Well, let me explain it. There are many African American people who do not have IDs. Many. There are many people who do not have driver's license and or state IDs. And the GOP knows that. There are many elderly people who don't have voter IDs, who don't have IDs, identification. Many. Let me give you one anecdote. Let me give you one example. A young man I represented some years ago. My firm represented this young man. And we, in addition to representing him in criminal court, we wanted to help this young man get his life together. 17-year-old young man. He turned 18 throughout our representation. And so we started working with him to get a job, to get back in school, try to get him in the military, all of that, because we care for these young men. So in addition to working out his case, and we were able to get the case dismissed, we also wanted to put him on the right path. The very first thing that we had to do was help him get an ID. 17-year-old young man, young African-American man, raised by his mother. Just him, his mother, and his sister, I believe. Maybe another sibling. He's a good kid. That wasn't the issue. He is a good kid. And we wanted to help him. So the first thing we had to do was to take him to get an ID. Now, let me tell you how difficult that was. He didn't have a car, and there were no buses. He didn't have any money for Uber, didn't have any money for any of that. So we personally took him to the DMV. And when he first got there, this is a true story. When he first got to the DMV, of course, they asked him for some kind of identification, birth certificate or something. He didn't have any of that. So we had to go back, and he had to, get with his mother and with his family, and they had to try to dig up birth certificate. So we were finally able to get what the DMV required. So we went back. And by the way, that DMV was like 30 miles from his house. 30 miles. So we took him back, and he got his state-issued ID. I could tell in his steps that he was a man who had pep in his step now. I mean, he got a valid state-issued ID. And that just opened the door for him, because then we were able to take him. I personally took him to a fast food restaurant. I spoke to the manager, whom I didn't know. I said, this young man needs a job. I am his attorney. I am his mentor. I need you to help him out. He said, fine. With your recommendation, I will give him a job. And he said, young man, let me see your ID. It's the first thing he asked for. Now, there are many, 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 many people in our community who don't have IDs, just like that young man. And the GOP knows it. They know that. So they target that population. And what that does is it keeps just enough of blacks away from the voting polls to give the GOP an advantage. Because as we saw in the video, they don't want everybody voting because they lose. They lose. So they don't want everyone voting. And that's one of the ways that they keep folks away from the polls. Students, college students is another demographic that don't have oftentimes state-issued IDs. They may have an ID from another state, or they may not have an ID. And the thing here in Texas is you can take your hunting license, your fishing license, and that can serve as your ID, but your college ID, that won't work here in the state of Texas. So voting IDs, I could go on, but voting IDs. Yes, of course. For most of us, showing our ID to vote is no problem at all. None. So when you think about all the people around you who, of course, got IDs, and you're saying to yourself, how in the world does someone not have an ID? That, whoever says that is a person who's out of touch with the African-American community. Because there are many blacks who don't have IDs. What else? Limited language assistance. So folks who don't speak the English language also are targeted in these voter suppression laws. Purging voter rolls. People who may haven't voted the last cycle, they'll go through and get rid of all those eligible voters. Closing or consolidating polling places. Oh, wow. So black folks tend to have these sort of atypical voting schedules because a lot of blacks are working a lot. And sometimes the best time for them to vote is on a Sunday, for example, or after hours, or by mail. One YouTuber said that anyone who votes by mail is up to no good. I mean, my jaw dropped. There are many people who vote by mail, people in the military, folk who are convalescent, folk who work a lot, just put their ballots in the mail. We know Donald Trump demonized mail-in ballots. We know that. And the GOP used that sort of thing to implement what they call voter integrity. Yet those states who implemented so-called voter integrity laws could not document hardly any voter fraud. It's all designed to keep certain people away from the polls. And again, remember, it's been the long-standing belief of those people that only white men with property should be able to vote. And that changed only because it had to as a result of the Civil War. And even more so after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. But there is that general belief that everybody shouldn't be voting. Inadequate election funding, mandating provisional ballots, cutting early voting periods. Yes, all that has happened. Shortening voting hours. People getting off work late can't vote because they got to stay on the job. I mean, that job is providing their income, their living. So what, risk getting fired to vote? Many say, nah, I got to keep my job. They know that. Insufficiently trained poll workers, partisan election officials, folks who got that secret agenda. Establishing at-large local offices to diminish minority votes. These are the new style voter suppression tactics. They affect black folks in the same way. It shaves off a percentage of black voters to tilt the scales in favor of the GOP. But what they don't realize is most of us, we feel voting in our souls. Like John Lewis used to say, voting is almost sacred. So we'll stand in them lines. And we all know that most of the long voting lines are where? In the black community. Because they have so few polling places, or they've shortened the hours, or the days. And so we all saw this last election cycle, black folks standing half a mile lines, 8 hours, taking a day off of work. All that's by design. You don't find any of that in white majority districts. You find that in the black community, the Latino community, and so on. Now, there's another thing that these folks do, something called racial gerrymandering. Let me explain to you what racial gerrymandering is and how vicious it is. So what is racial gerrymandering? Racial gerrymandering weakens voting power by diluting the votes of specific racial, ethnic, or political groups to favor white voters. So now with racial gerrymandering, the focus is not on the individual voter, it's on groups of voters. And what group might we be talking about, especially? Of course, African Americans. So, yeah, now I got here racial gerrymandering tends to be prohibited by Section 2 cases, mostly. In other words, Section 2 is the section of the Voting Rights Act that is most often used to fight racial gerrymandering. So with that in mind, what do our enemies do? Well, after they gutted the Section 4, which invalidated Section 5, what did they do? They turned their attention to Section 2. The section that is most often used against racial gerrymandering. Now, once again, I want you to understand what racial gerrymandering is. It is those prohibitive laws and tactics that whites have used to weaken the voting power of certain racial groups, not just individuals, but groups. The African American group, for example. So there was a case, Brnovich versus DNC, that went in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. Excuse me. And it was this case that Justice Sam Alito used this case to strip Section 2. I'm not making this up. Yes, so they first invalidated Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which did away with that pre-clearance. So then they set their eyes on Section 2. And they weakened it in the Brnovich versus DNC case. And I mean, they weakened it. Okay? I'm telling you how this has worked and developed over the years. And then the Allen versus Mulligan case is a case out of Alabama where the Alabama legislature drew up a voting map that greatly diluted, see, this is the racial gerrymandering, that greatly diluted the voting power of black people in Alabama. Although black folks made up a large percentage of Alabama, yet when the Alabama legislature, which is controlled by MAGA, the GOP, they drew up a map that pretty much had packaged all the black folks in one district out of 7 districts. And they sued under Section 2 and said, blacks sued, the NAACP, et cetera, sued and said, this is not fair. We ought to have at least 2 districts, given our population percentage. And so they sued. That case went in front of some federal judges who agreed with the blacks and said, yes, there ought to be 2 districts, 2 majority black districts, given their population percentage. So that case was appealed. Alabama appealed from those federal judges up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And to everybody's shock who keeps up with this, SCOTUS sided with the blacks this time under Section 2. And there's a reason why they did that. They did that because they just knew it would just be too much for them to, in a 10-year period, gut Section 4, Section 5, and then gut Section 2 to the point where not only are there voter suppression laws, but there's also now racial gerrymandering that's also being approved because MAGA, the GOP, right-wing folks have totally ripped apart the Voting Rights Act. So let me share a pictorial with you so you can see what I'm saying. Here are the maps. Map 1 is the map that the state of Alabama drew up first. 7 districts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 1 black district, District 7. Although blacks made up a considerable percentage of the Alabama population, quite naturally. At one time, there were more blacks in Alabama than whites because of all the enslaved Africans that they had brought in. So despite that large population percentage, blacks had 1 voting district under map 1. That's racial gerrymandering. The voting districts should be comparable, commensurate with the population percentage. So the federal judge's decision saying that there should be 2 black voting districts was upheld by SCOTUS for the reason I gave you earlier. I think they just felt like it would just be too much in the span of 10 years to completely eradicate the Voting Rights Act. And so SCOTUS approved Map 2, which has 2 majority black voting districts. But had they not done anything, had they not said anything, had they not fought back, racial gerrymandering would have greatly diluted black voters in the state of Alabama. So what must we do? What must we do? I got to tell you what we got to do. Principally, what we need to do is we need to do everything we can to get Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would repair Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which would then require those notorious states to once again have to seek preclearance. It is just that important. You heard in the speech that Merrick Garland gave that at the end of his speech, he too said that the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is absolutely necessary. All the reason why you need to vote. That's the reason why, one of many, that you need to vote, because the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, when the Democrats controlled the House, they approved it. And the Democrats had a very slight majority, even in the Senate, but the GOP filibustered it. And the Democrats did not have enough votes to overcome that filibuster. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act died basically in the House. Never saw the light of day. And now that the House is controlled by the GOP, and that is largely because a whole lot of us did not go out and vote, listening to these people telling us to vote the couch or even vote GOP, they were able to take control of the House. And so the Voting Rights Act will remain very, very weakened unless in November we go out in record numbers, and re-elect Joe Biden, increase the Democrats in the Senate and House, we can get the John Lewis bill passed. And Joe Biden will sign it into law. He's already said he would. And we could also get the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act passed. All of these things to help the African-American community, and especially black men. With the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, I mean, that is to reform policing. And who is it that's most likely to be shot and killed by police officers? Black men. And yet it's black men supporting this stuff and telling the rest of us to vote the couch because the Democrats haven't done nothing for black people. It is factually wrong. It's definitely misleading. Years ago, I read the book, The Miseducation of the Negro. Go read that book. That's my recommendation. I try to recommend a book every video. Read that book, The Miseducation of the Negro. All right, so that has brought me to the end of this video. So much more I got to say. I'll save it for the next time. Again, like, share, comment, subscribe, click the bell. Until the next time, peace.